Story 1. I remember hearing stories about witches kidnapping children and sucking their blood, or parents who fall into a deep sleep. Many years ago as a kid this was very frightening. I thought the stories were just to scare us, but I was talking to someone who claimed that this story was true. One of my friends witnessed such an event. One night while everyone was sleeping they began to hear his brother-in-law's baby crying in a very strange way. They all lived in the same house and couldn't find an explanation as to why the parents didn't seem to do anything to calm him down. When they went to investigate and managed to open the door, they saw that the parents were in a deep sleep. They suddenly heard a knock on the window. When they turned their heads and saw a black figure outside, they ran after the figure, but they didn't see where the figure had gone. They woke up the parents who weren't aware of the situation. They couldn't find the baby. After a while of searching they found the child under the bed. The little boy had bruises on his body. The witch who had jumped out the window had sucked the child's blood. Another acquaintance had something similar to the previous thing happen to him, only this time with a tragic end. The baby was found dead with many bruises on his body. They also saw a black figure, a figure of a woman who seemed to be floating. Her family and neighbors ran after her, but when she was aware of the people chasing her she climbed a tree. She was a couple seconds from being caught, but she suddenly turned into a ball of fire and flew away. You may not believe this story, but the person who told me about it said he took precautions when his son was a baby. It is believed that in order for the child to be safe from witch attacks, it is necessary to place a pair of scissors in the shape of a cross under the bed or crib and thus preventing any witches from sucking their blood. Story 2. A friend of mine said that when her youngest daughter was born, they went to a small community where she was originally from because her ex-husband was in Canada. She was waiting for his return so they can baptize the girl. 2 weeks after the girl was born, another child was born in town. Weeks later another one was born somewhere else. The fact is that my friend's daughter was already a month and a week old when rumors began to spread that they had seen fireballs roaming around the night sky. She didn't believe any of that. Her grandmother however did and decided to take the child to her room. Her grandmother says that early morning she started to hear scratching on the window. The grandmother hugged the girl and began praying. The scratching intensified to the point it could be heard all over the house. The sounds even managed to wake everybody up. My friend's grandmother called everyone to her room and told them to pray with her. Even after the noises stopped the grown-ups didn't go back to sleep so they could keep watch. The next day the grandmother went up to the roof to put a mirror and sprinkled salt. Since it is a community and they were not the only ones to suffer these types of attacks, they went to the nearest town and asked a priest to baptize the babies as soon as possible. The baptisms would be the following Saturday. One Thursday morning around 3 a.m. they heard glass breaking on the roof. As soon as they heard this the women began to pray while the brother-in-law left the house armed with a machete. Some neighbors also joined in brandishing their own machetes. It said witches are afraid of sharp objects, that's why people place scissors or needles in the shape of a cross. The neighbors began to chase the witch down, but unfortunately she turned into a fireball and managed to escape. When they got onto the roof of the house they indeed found the mirror had been shattered, and on Saturday all the babies were baptized. To this day that witch hasn't showed up in that community, and whenever children are born they are immediately baptized. Story 3. In some rural areas witches aren't seen as frequently as before. People still continue to perform rituals to protect themselves from the power of witches. Mostly because of the stories that are passed down from generation to generation. For example, in a small town called Bermejalo in the state of Durango, people tell the story of a little boy whose blood had been sucked away by witches when he was just 6 months old. This happened about 40 years ago. Little Jesus had not been baptized, so he was very vulnerable to being attacked by witches. One of his older sisters says that although the explanation for his death is asphyxiation or crib death, the night his brother died many strange things happened. That night the neighbors across the street, who were very close to Jesus' family, heard some very loud whistling. Reyes, the neighbor across the street, was praying when the whistling started. She said that when she stopped praying, she and her husband began to feel very sleepy. With great effort she reached the window and saw 4 owls sitting on the roof of little Jesus' house. Each owl was sitting on a different corner. She kept trying to pray, but she had trouble staying awake. She also tried to wake her husband who had fallen asleep beside her. She shouted at him to help her pray. She suspected something horrible was at play, and it had something to do with those owls whistling outside. It was as if the whistling made people fall in a deep sleep. After a while the owls stopped whistling and slowly flew away. Moments later Reyes was finally able to get up and shake her husband awake. The two ran across the street to little Jesus' house. They began to knock on the door. After a while, with no response, they began knocking with more intensity to the point they almost broke the windows from the amount of force they were knocking on the doors with. When Jesus' mom finally woke up, Reyes told her what she had seen. They quickly ran to Jesus' room, but it was too late. The boy was already dead. Roberto, Jesus' older brother, was around 22 years old at the time when Jesus died. He remembered on that night he was coming back home from a party, and a couple of blocks before arriving, he suddenly started to get very sleepy, and once he managed to get inside, he completely collapsed onto his bed. Stories like these make anyone wonder about the existence of witches and what they can do. Today in that town it is custom that when a child has not been baptized, the family places a lit candle and a glass of holy water near the baby's crib to keep the witches away. Story 4. I am going to tell you about something that happened to me in 2004. I live in Mezcal in Apodaca. When I came to live here, I heard comments that in this neighborhood there were many witches. In that year my daughter Rocio was born. We have a 2-story house, and at that time we owned a grocery store. Due to lack of space on the ground floor, we acquired a crib that couldn't be rocked. That afternoon my wife had put the baby in her crib. While she was sleeping, we were chatting on the first floor. Suddenly we heard noises that sounded like someone was hitting the wall. My wife screamed the baby. She ran upstairs. And we saw the girl lying on the floor. The bedroom window was also open. We couldn't find the explanation as to what happened. My daughter was only 9 days old and the crib could not be rocked. To this day when I remember that event, I can't find any other explanation other than witches were trying to take my child. Story 5. My grandmother said that witches come out at night and turn into turkeys with big eyes as red as fire. It's said they use a special type of butter to remove their arms and legs so they can turn into such creatures. At night they look for newborns to take their life. Several people have told me that they have seen children with bruises all over their bodies and lifeless eyes. This happened to a friend of mine when she lived in Texas. She says that one day she was in the kitchen with her husband. Her newborn was in her room alone, sleeping, when she heard her start to cry very loudly. Her husband told her to leave her alone. Being the mother of the child, she knew that those weren't regular cries. She says that when she entered the room, the baby's legs dangled over the edge of the bed as if something had been pulling on her. This same friend had something similar happen with her mother on one of those nights when her father went to work. She was born in Tlalnepantla, state of Mexico, near a cave where witches supposedly transformed, sometime after her husband had gone to work. Her mother told her that she began to hear the dogs bark loudly and the clucking of a turkey. She heard how the large creature began to approach and knock on the door. After a while the damn animal climbed onto the tin roof as if it was trying to find a way inside. The mother knew that in order to ward off witches you have to leave some scissors open on the window or under the baby's bed, and that's what she did. She found the scissors and put them next to a window and she began to pray. This worked like a charm because moments later that thing left. The next morning the screams of a man in pain could be heard. Why, you may ask? Because this man's 1-year-old child had all of its blood sucked by witches. This man began to swear.
Damn those witches to hell, they took my son, take me if you dare.
The next day the man was found dead on his bed, his body covered in bruises and lifeless eyes. The first thing I thought of after hearing this story was that the stories were the same ones that my grandmother told me. At work there was another girl who was from Guadalajara who told me, I remember seeing a flying turkey with bright red eyes. She says that at her grandmother's ranch, she was outside one night playing with her younger sister, when her sister told her, "Look at that huge bird." She turned to see what her sister was pointing at, and to her surprise, there was indeed a huge bird whose eyes resembled burning coals. Without knowing what it was, she began to yell at her grandmother. "Grandma, look, 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 come and see that bird up in the tree." Her grandma knew what it was, and she ordered them to go to the house and start sewing. Sewing is also another method to ward off witches. They entered the house and began to prepare the needle and thread. Their grandmother began to pray as loud as she could. The strange bird left after a while and the girls went to bed. Their grandmother put more open scissors next to the window. The next day she remembers that several people with guns and dogs began to prepare themselves to hunt the witch. They waited until it got dark, and when they saw a ball of fire the women began to pray. Apparently it was some kind of special prayer that I don't know the name of. The women's praying seemed to work because moments later the witch fell from the sky. The men began to search with their dogs, and to their surprise they found a naked old woman lying on the dirt convulsing. They locked her in jail, while they were waiting for the priest of the nearby town to arrive to burn her. The woman in jail went crazy. The witches have something called Bayo. It's like a spell that makes you fall into a deep sleep. After a while everyone began to fall asleep, a sleep so deep that the townspeople didn't wake up until the afternoon of the next day. When they came to, they couldn't find the witch and the jail cell was empty. Ever since then the witch was never seen or heard from again.